Welcome to the I'm All Over the Place podcast with Dara Star Tucker. And I have my handy dandy guest host with me once again today, Mr.
Greg Bryant here.
Thank you for being here, Greg. So good to have you. Is this our first day back?
This is the first of 2023. Congratulations.
We are sorry to have been away so long. Life has been lifing. That's all I can say.
Absolutely.
Life has been lifing.
We're back anyhow. Tell them where they can find you.
You can find me on all social media platforms. Instagram, Dara Tucker B. Everywhere else is Dara Star Tucker. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, Patreon, all of it.
And stop right there,
Dara Star Tucker.
Because many of you have asked, how can you contribute to Dara? You love her content. You love her informative videos. Patreon is one way to show your tangible love. And you've started getting more active over there, but it's a platform, if you don't know about it, where you can basically, for whatever you choose, $5 a month, $20 a month, $2 a month, support creators like Dara Star Tucker, helping to keep us educated and laughing and melodically soothed. You do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, well, I try to share some. This week I shared, actually, on my Patreon, I shared a breakdown that I did not share with anyone else. So they got an exclusive look at a breakdown that for me just kind of didn't work in a narrative sense. And so I shared it with them. I'm going to cut it up and I'm probably going to make it into two separate breakdowns. But the patrons actually got to see the full Monty, as it were. Mm-hmm. So, there's cool things that happen over there. And as I'm getting ready to record the album, getting ready to release the album, it's already recorded. Mm-hmm. They're going to get some exclusive previews on album stuff, all kinds of things.
Wait a minute, you got an album coming out? We'll talk about that later. Today's episode is about All Over the Blackface.
Wow.
What is it about Blackface that makes you keep coming back to it? Can we be done already?
Well, Greg wants to be
It's
done.
awful. It's horrible.
No, I think America's not done with blackface. I think that's a part of why I keep coming back to the topic. And I feel like a lot of people, you'll hear these kind of false equivalencies that people spew out. We were asking for police reform and now, we're getting rid of Aunt Jemima or we're getting rid of, we're talking about blackface or whatever. And it's like, you know what? First of all, these subjects are not as disconnected as you might think. When you talk about, real policy reforms and things like that, and the way that Black people's images are used in popular media. Media criticism, media literacy is a big topic for me. And that's how Blackface tends to tie in and relate to the things that, I'm interested in talking about. But I did a whole video on the Aunt Jemima thing and how that it really is a deeper issue than just a pancake box. It's a deeper issue than just, get these images off and change these names. It really has to do with how Black people are presented and how we are discussed and the ownership that we do or do not have of our own images in the media. And media is a very powerful thing. Mm-hmm. And, we all know we are a very visual culture, a very visual society, and we're becoming even more so moving forward. It's not becoming less so, it's becoming more so. How we present ourselves and what, of the public perception is of us as individuals and as a culture. So these issues are vitally important to talk about, along with police reform, along with policy changes that need to happen at the governmental level, and voting and activism. And I talk about all those things also. But these issues right here, in terms of how Black people are presented in the media, are vitally important to discuss. And with every generation, it becomes more apparent because with every generation, we forget.
That's a good point.
If a 14 or 15-year-old has absolutely no idea about the history of, how Black people have been denigrated and kind of dragged through the mud in media. And, when Blackface was at its height in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of the people that were being entertained by this art form in quotation marks, hadn't even ever really encountered or seen a Black person. This was their experience of Blackness. Mm-hmm. And moving forward, in the present day, it really hasn't changed that much. Mm-hmm. It really hasn't changed that much. These cartoonish caricatures, these buffoonish caricatures that people see, whether it's, I have great respect for Tyler Perry, but if it's somebody made some comment about Medea in my comment section just yesterday or today, and I'm like, no, this is not a Black person that is comparing, I do this character of my mom in my videos. A Black person isn't going to make a comment like that. This is a white person who really doesn't know that much about Black people. And as soon as they see a matronly Black figure, the first thing that comes to their mind is what? Medea. Because that is what has been shoved down their throats through media.
Yeah.
So these images and how we are portrayed, how we portray ourselves, has a whole lot to do with where we stand in the culture and how we are perceived. This stuff goes way deeper than just, we want to argue or mince about syrup bottles and all of these things that seem to many people to be antiquated or to have nothing to do with their world. But it's not true. It's not the case. It's a very real and present issue.
It is. And I think you're right. Blackface is a cultural literacy issue. And you've asked the question with one of your most recent breakdowns, which I'm going to pull up here for us to take a look at. Is blackface ever okay? Is it ever all right or permissible, acceptable to use blackface? Let's pause right here and take a look at that.
Are there acceptable uses of blackface? I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. There was this interesting category of black and brown face on television, mostly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that was meant to call out racism. Usually a character would do something misguided, and black or brown face would be used to teach some deeper lesson about racial and cultural sensitivity. Archie Bunker had a blackface episode, as did Bewitched, Gimme a Break, and The Golden Girls. The problem that I have with a lot of these very special episodes is that although they were ostensibly meant to teach, it's still very clear that the gag of having a white person paint their face and pretend to be a black person was as entertaining to a mostly white viewing audience then as it was in the days of Minstrelsy. The lessons are generally pretty flimsy, and you might start to question whether bringing that imagery to contemporary viewing audiences was doing more harm than good. It was still a gimmick, it was still done for shock value, and in most cases, it was still deeply offensive. The Bewitched episode, for example, was very well-intentioned. Samantha uses her powers to turn her family's skin brown momentarily to confuse a racist. She turns him brown too. I'm sure at the time this was seen as very forward-thinking, but looking back on it, it just feels cringy to see these characters all painted up in brown makeup. Using blackface to stand up to racism is an interesting tactic. If there's ever been a smart use of this, I'd say it was on The Dick Van Dyke Show in an episode called A Show of Hands from 1965. Rob and Laura are invited by an NAACP-like organization to accept an award on behalf of The Alan Brady Show that highlights the show's exemplary record on diversity. The day that they're set to accept the award, Rob and Laura accidentally get black dye all over their hands. What sets this episode apart from some of the clumsier attempts to use this device as a teaching tool is that there's never a time when the characters in the audience are not acutely aware of the problematic nature of Rob and Laura's conundrum. There are never any attempts to squeeze a few cheap laughs out of the sight gag. It also helps that no one is painting their face or doing any silly dances that reference America's minstrel past. The embarrassment that both characters feel at their clumsy mistake is the focus of the show, and we eventually see this through the eyes of the black characters on the show. It gives the whole episode a sense of humanity, and it doesn't make blackness a punchline. Gimme a Break made an even more pointed commentary about the offensive nature of blackface. Sam inexplicably convinces Joey to show up at Nell's church in full blackface singing an Al Jolson number of all things, because apparently these are the kinds of activities that 8-year-olds engaged in 1984. This episode probably contains the strongest rebuke of blackface ever presented on primetime television, even to this day. But putting a child in blackface on national television to make this point harken back to the days of Judy Garland and Shirley Temple being trotted out in blackface early in their careers. It still feels exploitative and wrong. What's interesting is that newer shows like 30 Rock, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and Scrubs also use this device, but with little to no focus on the greater social or cultural harm that blackface has done. The early to mid-2000s brought a rise in black and brown face on television, but it was often done for the inherent shock value, and none of the characters were ever shown learning anything. It's likely that because contemporary audiences are so far removed from the origins of blackface minstrelsy, the idea of characters doing black or brown face feels more original and less harmful than it actually is. It's really only been about 10 years or so that blackface in popular media has been roundly criticized, even in a comedic or satirical context. People were getting away with this as recently as the early 2010s. Many of these episodes have been pulled from digital and streaming services, a move I vehemently disagree with. Hopefully we're entering an era where this cheap device will be viewed for what it actually is, a strange compulsion to play racial dress-up in the name of comedy, one that usually does more harm than good.
Okay, so I have a prompt that I would like you to respond to after hearing and watching this. The Show of Hands episode of Dick Van Dyke's Show versus Tropic Thunder, the movie where Robert Downey dons his blackface. I know that was coming up recurring in your comment section a lot. Mm-hmm. Why is one okay, you say, and why is one over the line?
I mean, I think we first have to answer why I would even make an episode like this, an episode of The Breakdown, asking, is blackface ever okay? Because a lot of the response, not a lot, but there were a handful of responses where, people just sort of reflexively, mostly black folks reflexively went, no, it is not okay to do blackface ever. And theoretically, that's correct. I mean, it's like asking, is it ever okay to, abuse a child or something?
Mm.
It's not the same thing.
Mm.
But if someone were to pose a ridiculous question, like when is it okay to?
It's a different kind of abuse. I know the blackface is a different kind of abuse.
You would reflexively respond, no, never. It's not ever okay.
Yeah.
But what is really being asked here? It's not is blackface ever a positive thing? That's not really what's being asked, and should it be done in sincerity? What's really being asked, again, we're talking about now, we're referencing media criticism. We're speaking of the portrayal of blackface in media. Is the portrayal of blackface in media ever okay if it is directed towards a specific purpose? And that ostensibly with a lot of these episodes was learning or toward teaching that this is a racist practice. Mm-hmm. So in certain cases, any negative behavior in a certain context is permissible to depict in media if there is a greater purpose behind it, if it serves the narrative of that particular outlet or that platform or that show or whatever it is. We've seen all kinds of deplorable and heinous things that have been portrayed in movies, in television, even in music. But the question is not, is that behavior a positive thing? The question is there justification for the depiction of this thing? Mm-hmm. That's the greater question that's being asked. So I want to clarify that in the first place. And so I feel like with the episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, and I think most of those episodes are up on YouTube if you have not seen the Dick Van Dyke Show. It's my favorite show of all time. And partly because it gets things like this right. It was really ahead of its time. I think the motivations behind that depiction come through in the writing. They come through in the storyline. They come through in the narrative. The whole objective of the writers, meaning Carl Reiner, and I don't know who else would have been directly behind writing that specific episode, but the objective of the writer, him or herself, was not, hey, I miss blackface.
Right.
And I really want to say it. Wasn't it fun when we got to see that back in the day?
Yeah.
And so that intent comes through in the way that episode developed. And it really was kind of it was a quirky, almost like an I Love Lucy kind of plot device. They accidentally dipped their hands in black dye, which of course, no one would give a second thought. It's just a kind of a comedic, silly thing that happens in a sitcom.
But they were going to their equivalent of the NAACP's luncheon to accept an award for the show that the character Dick Van Dyke wrote for. Mm-hmm. And so going to that convention immediately, they were concerned, we're going to embarrass ourselves and hurt our friends.
Right.
Right?
It's immediately apparent once Rob reveals, oh my goodness, we have this dinner to go to. It's not like they just show up at the dinner. That would be the cheap device, I think.
Exactly.
If they just showed up at the dinner, didn't realize it, didn't think about it, mm-hmm. and then something happened where they got their hands dyed and it was just all played for
They
laughs.
actually covered over, I'm revealing the episode, but they cover over their hands initially in gloves.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to avoid having to reveal that this is an issue.
Right.
Because they want to be respectful of their friends. And it's a cutesy way of addressing it. But like you say, and it brings it forward, they're not trying to hurt their friends. They know this is wrong.
Right. And they're also not attempting...
In 1965.
In 1965. They are also, and again, from a media criticism standpoint, they are also not attempting to squeeze cheap laughs out of that plot device. The only real laugh that we experience is one of that's kind of stunned realization when Rob says, "Oh my goodness, we have this dinner to go to." Mm-hmm. That's the only point at which, if you actually watch the episode, it's not even really a laugh. There are a few chuckles, but Rob and Laura's expressions tell the whole story. It's just like, "Oh dear God, oh no, this is terrible.
Exactly.
This is not something that would be okay. Now suddenly this is cast in a completely different light."
Get it off, we're not going to that dinner. Boy, that is for sure.
Well, what about Alan? I thought you said he practically ordered you to go.
Honey, if we walked into the crystal room with our hands looking like this, people would think we were out of our minds.
Couldn't you pretend it's a gag?
A gag?
Well, they know you're a comedy writer.
Millie, that is positively in the worst taste.
Well, it's not a matter of taste.
Honey, you know what the CIU is, don't you?
Well, of course. The Committee for Interracial Understanding.
Funny, huh?
Oh, Committee for Interracial Understanding.
That's what the award is for.
Rob, we can't go like this.
Even if Alan ordered me to.
It's really a brilliant plot, in my humble opinion.
And when they first reveal their hands without the gloves at the dinner, isn't there not a gasp, but a pause before the laugh? It's not just immediate laughter. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong.
Right. Well, Rob explains at this dinner when he finally says, "Hey, this happened," for whatever reason, Rob decides to tell the audience, and it's a mixed audience, both black and white people. He decides to tell them what happened. And he says, if we're really wanting to move towards racial understanding, then we have to be able to have difficult conversations. So we just want to tell you what happened, and maybe hopefully you'll understand, the conundrum that we were in, because we're here lying about what's going on with our hands and why our hands are covered. Yeah. And so then he reveals it, and everybody sort of pauses for a minute, and then there's a polite little chuckle of understanding, which was the point of the episode. So yeah, a lot of people didn't really get that reference because, obviously Dick Van Dyke is, it's an old show, but it's one that I watch regularly and have for a long time. So if you haven't taken a look at that episode, it's one of the only ones that I really could ever refer to as possibly a permissible use of this device, for a lot of reasons. They're not painting their face, first of all, but it's handled so carefully.
And they are in blackface, black hands, but which is the same. But there is an extra care and attention given to immediately establishing, hey, this is wrong. This is not cool. This is not satire. We understand we could face repercussions by appearing. It's laid out as brilliantly and clearly, in my opinion, and I'm not playing to them. I'm being honest. It's brilliant. You were right. You're exactly right. Now, Tropic Thunder, which is occurring in your comments section these days.
And the breakdown was really focused more on television. Right. It was really focused only on television.
Right. But some persons have asked, this movie, is it also justified? And to be fully transparent, I haven't watched the full movie, but I know the premise. The Robert Downey Jr. character in the movie is a method actor, and he goes the extra mile to don blackface for a character. The writers of the film know this is egregious, and they play up to the egregiousness in an effort to show the wildly inappropriate nature of this offense, which makes it even more egregious and offensive.
No, this movie, I'm telling you, anytime I've done probably a good 5 different videos on different aspects of blackface and, digital blackface, all kinds of, nooks and crannies of this issue, because it's something that people are curious about, and they kind of want to understand these nuances around. And anytime I talk about blackface, this is the number one question that comes up in my comments is, what about Robert Downey Jr.? What about Robert Downey Jr. in blackface? And I even saw, someone who put out a video that said on TikTok that said, well, Robert Downey Jr. wasn't doing blackface. He was playing an actor that did blackface. And I understand the delineation, but that's usually the delineation. I mean, Joey in Give Me a Break wasn't doing blackface. He was playing a little boy who had been told to do blackface and showed up in this way. So to me, creating that distinction and creating that delineation does not make it any better. It doesn't really, Soul Man, which was a movie that we grew up watching, I grew up watching, we didn't know any better, where a dude, he paints up and becomes a black person with wig and everything to get an affirmative action type scholarship to go to college. Yeah. How is that any different than what Robert Downey Jr. did? I mean, I understand Tropic Thunder is a better movie, but it's really not any different.
Yeah. Comedically, I remember first seeing it in clips on the Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder movie. I don't know if it's See No Evil, Hear No Evil. Folks will correct it in the comment section.
Oh, it's something about
Bustin' Loose or something.
No. I know what it is. Anyway,
I'm sorry, folks. Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy. But that, even as a little kid, was seriously off-putting. Like, something is not right with this.
I don't see Robert Downey Jr.'s foray into blackface as being any different. And as a matter of fact, I see it as actually being a little bit more egregious, as you said, Greg, because he's not only doing blackface, he's doing black voice. He's doing the whole character. It isn't just, at least in Soul Man, he just put the paint on his face and put a wig on and went about his business. Robert Downey Jr. was doing a whole character. His character was doing a whole character.
For 400 years, that word has kept us down. What the f? Took a whole lot of time just to get up that hill. Now we up in the big leagues. Kid, I'll turn it back. Long as we live, it's you and me, baby.
That's the theme song for the Jeffersons. You really need help.
And just because the theme song don't make it not true.
So, no, this is not, it's not one step removed. It is not any better. And Robert Downey Jr. himself was quoted as saying, well, Ben Stiller had to convince him, who made the movie, Ben Stiller had to convince him to do this character. And then he was like, well, one of the great selling points was that I got to be a black man for a whole summer. So come on. He was having fun. Robert Downey Jr. is a great actor. He's one of the better actors of our generation.
Oh.
I love him.
Okay.
But he doesn't get a pass from me. I don't know why people are so determined to give Robert Downey Jr. a pass for Tropic Thunder. He does not get one from me. No, love you, Robert. I really love him. But he does not get a pass. Why would he? I understand satire. Pretty much everyone in that movie, in Tropic Thunder, is one of my comedic favorites. Jack Black is in that movie. Ben Stiller, I love. It's a star-studded cast. Tom Cruise is in that movie. And of course, Robert Downey Jr. It's packed with, I don't think there's really barely one woman. I think Yvette Nicole Brown is probably the only woman with any lines in that entire movie. It's just, it's a sausage fest. But I love it. It's great. But that movie is extremely irreverent and insensitive. There's a conversation that, if you've seen Tropic Thunder, there's a conversation that happens between Robert Downey Jr. and Ben Stiller that, to me, is where they're talking about special needs people and playing these characters and stuff. It's even worse than the freaking blackface. In my estimation, it's the whole movie. It's just one of those, in your face, like, we're just going to throw the worst possible crap at you. I'm not going to sit here and be sanctimonious and act like there weren't funny things in that movie. Yeah, the movie was funny. And I'm one to laugh at irreverent comedy. Greg can tell you, pretty much every comedian that I love is like
over the
raunchy,
line.
The stuff that has Greg, if he could turn red, it would
I'm
have
just
him
kind of like,
red. Yeah, I'm that person. So it's not like I don't get the satire. I do.
Yeah, she's a dark humor. She likes the dark stuff.
Offensive humor, dark humor, but not just for its own sake. Like, smart
Sure.
humor
No,
that
yeah.
can also kind of
Yeah.
push the line. So I get that part of it, but no, RDJ does not get a pass from me. RDJ does not get a pass from me.
God.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I'm not sorry, really.
No, you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. But there are episodes in TV shows over the last 25 years that have still employed this tactic. Now we're talking about something that's existed from the minstrel days of Daddy Rice. If you don't know that name, look it up. The first white entertainer to bring blackface minstrelsy over the world.
And blackface minstrelsy started to become popular with black entertainers too.
Absolutely.
Because it was the only way that they would be accepted as entertainers.
Only way they could work.
It was the most popular form of entertainment in the United States.
Absolutely.
From probably the mid 1800s through like the early, early part of the 20th century.
The end of slavery until yesterday.
Yeah, it's pretty much all black folks could do to get in front of a white audience.
But to catch people up, there's modern examples still happening in the past 25 years. You've made a list.
Yeah, I mean, I have. There's a list of these kind of older shows that have used, because people started flooding the comments once I put that video up, because I referenced, it was Give Me a Break, Joey dressing up like Al Jolson, and it was Bewitched. Samantha turns her family brown to stump a racist. And then there was another episode. I can't remember the other episode. Anyway, I referenced a handful of episodes of classic TV shows that had used this device, and of course, the Dick Van Dyke Show, which we just talked about. But people started flooding my comments. I did not know, and I was making the point that this was always done in this era, like after the 50s. People understood this was not a good practice, right. And so if they employed it, it was always ostensibly to teach a lesson. Mm-hmm. Which is just hilarious to me that they could find so many ways and reasons to keep doing this through this mostly 70s, 80s, 90s. For some reason, in the 2000s, well, in the 90s, really, it dropped off. You didn't really see this. You saw it in the 70s and 80s a lot. Yeah. In the 90s, I don't really see many examples of it. Yeah. Maybe one or two. And then in the early 2000s, all of a sudden, it pops back up again. So I want to run through a few episodes. And if you're watching the video version of this on YouTube, just FYI, if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple, you could also go and watch the video version of this on YouTube if you want to see these examples. I'm going to put them up on the screen. But Different Strokes, what was one of my favorite shows as a kid, did an episode. And I'm going to show a clip very quickly here just for the YouTube audience.
What would you say if I were to tell you that I were really black?
And this is Kimberly, who was the sister. If you don't know, Arnold and Willis were two little black boys who were adopted by Mr. Drummond. And he had a daughter, Kimberly, who was white, of course. And for whatever reason, she, was dating this guy who was racist. And then she just decides to don blackface to kind of scare this guy and be like, hey, what if I was black? Would you still date me? I mean, full wig and everything. Yeah. Just another example of blackface being used to teach a racist a lesson. Like who decided that this was necessary?
1980s.
Because it happened a lot.
The 80s were a weird time.
Another episode, I have not seen the Touched by an Angel episode, but I have seen Roma Downey dressed up, painted up completely in blackface. And that would have been the 90s, I believe.
But today, I understood for the first time that even an angel must be stronger and tougher and prouder if she's going to make a difference in black skin.
Designing Women had an episode, which actually just aired recently. Several people put in my comments, they just put an episode up of Designing Women. And I went back and watched it after people started mentioning it, where Delta Burke's character, they're doing an act where they are the Supremes for a talent show. Oh, man. And she decides, she's Southern. I guess they're all Southern. But she decides that it would really sell it if she dressed up, if she painted up. And she felt like everybody should do it.
Call my name. I'll be there in a hurry. On that you can depend and never worry.
Question, had Anthony, the house manager, join the staff?
Yeah, he was there. He was there. And it kind of irritated me the way that they handled that one because they turned around and asked him, hey, Anthony, what do you think about...
Who is African-American, if you don't know the show. Yeah,
he's black, Meshack Taylor. He was like, well, what do you think about her putting this paint on? And he was like, well, I understand how it could increase the realism and, blah, 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 blah. But I don't know. He was very non-committal.
Yeah.
And it was like the white women were more upset about this.
It was a white
Dixie
show.
Carter.
Let's just be honest.
Yeah, Dixie Carter and them were more upset about the idea of this than he was.
Yeah.
It did irritate me very much that they had the black character kind of equivocating in that way.
It was a white show.
I'm like, what is that? But yeah, they're still airing that today. It's kind of interesting how they have not taken that out of circulation. MASH did a blackface episode that wasn't. I watched and I was like, man, would I have even realized that was supposed to be blackface if somebody hadn't told me? There was a racist who said it's an army hospital during the Korean War, and he said, well, I don't want any black blood. They had to do a blood transfusion or something. He said he didn't want blood from black people, and so they slowly, I guess, started using some sort of, I don't know what they put on his face. It wasn't paint, or it wasn't supposed to be paint in the plot, but to slowly kind of start to turn his skin darker over the course of a few days and make him think that, I guess, that he got this blood from a black person, that it turned him black. And they didn't really make a huge issue of it. It was just, the guy was kind of humbled, I guess, in the end.
Yeah.
The Office has a blackface episode where Dwight's character is a trip. Like, I was actually looking at I caught a little bit of an episode the other day where Dwight made a reference. This stuff if you don't know, I studied German studies is one of the degrees that I have, and so I've spent a lot of time in Germany and Switzerland and things like that. So there is a tradition there with Sinterklaas, and he has. Really, this is more so in the Netherlands, but Dwight is supposed to be from Germany, and he has the episode that I watched. He was making reference to his grandfather being banished to Argentina or escaping to Argentina from Germany. And if you know anything about the history of the Nazi party, then you know where this is going. Yeah. And he said something about his own passport to Argentina being revoked.
Oh, my.
He couldn't get there. So they're constantly making these references, which is just hilarious to me, of Dwight having this history of Nazism in his family, which is, it's horrible and hilarious at the same time.
Yeah.
But he was trying to bring this tradition over, more like a Dutch tradition, because they still do this today.
Okay.
This Sinterklaas with his assistant, who's Zwarte Piet, I don't know how they pronounce it in the Dutch language. But it's Black Pete is the character. And he is the assistant to their Santa Claus. And some people say, oh, he's a chimney, and he's black. He's a chimney sweep, and so that's why he has this dust all over his face. No, he was a servant. He was a slave. If you actually look into the history of this character, he was Santa Claus. He was a slave. Okay, so he's black, and people still to this day, it's becoming kind of more of a controversial thing over there.
Yeah.
But there was a character in the office that was showing up to like an office party that, because Dwight was, I think he was supposed to be Sinterklaas.
Okay.
I hope I'm saying that right. And his assistant was coming. He's the little dude that he kind of hangs around with, was dressed up like Black Pete.
Oh,
and they just show the scene for just a quick second, but they've taken that off the air.
Okay.
And they don't show that anymore. Yeah, America's Next Top Model. We know of many egregious moments where, they did race swapping and that kind of thing. Mork and Mindy. Yeah, Mork and Mindy had an episode.
These shows have done this.
Where they turned some Klan members brown. And I'll show a little bit of that on the YouTube as well. But the newer ones, I guess, is what I'm a little more interested in kind of focusing on.
Okay.
The newer shows that have implemented this. Because like I said, it sort of died down in the 90s. There was a period where I think it just sort of went out of fashion to even reference the fact that it had happened at one time. It was just a non-issue. And I remember when Spike Lee's movie, I don't remember what year Bamboozled came out, but I remember when that movie came out, I thought, well, who needs this film? Why are we making satire around blackface? Like, I haven't seen this done in years. This is kind of a non-issue. Why is he making it an issue? This makes no sense to me. And it seems like right after that movie happened, all of a sudden, it became a fashionable thing, or it became a common thing to start. And I'm glad you said
that word, fashionable. Full disclosure, I've seen maybe almost half Spike Lee's films. Haven't seen them all. But that one came at a really crucial and critical time with what was going on in the music hip hop specifically, and what was going on television. And I think for him to bring that movie out in the 90s, where we're having this, I don't want to say come to Jesus moment, but reckoning, if you will, with the N-word, and reckoning with images and stereotypes, specifically Black people promoting stereotypes. That was a brilliant film for me. And they missed the substance of that film. It wasn't just a message aimed at Black people. It was kind of airing out this inner conflict that we've had for years. And when do we draw the line to stop it before it becomes something that takes someone over? And we've seen folks like, Martin Lawrence and others grapple with that duality of making folks laugh, but keeping your sanity and your dignity.
So you're speaking
Dave
more,
Chappelle as well.
You're speaking more about just minstrelsy in general, not necessarily blackface.
But what exactly? But if you take the minstrelsy equation away, then you're left with what you said, the facade, the actual form and fashion of it, which there was a movie about this, so maybe we can put this on our television episode. But kiki, ha ha, he he, it takes away the sting. No, it doesn't. It's still very painful. And you've removed away the discussion under why. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a deeper and possibly a more interesting conversation to have around just this idea of minstrelsy. I mentioned Tyler Perry earlier, and he comes under a lot of criticism within the Black community for being someone who perpetuates these minstrel tropes and brings them into the present day. Martin Lawrence is someone who is often accused of that, or who was, at the height of his fame. Tiffany Haddish, gets accused of it a lot. And as you said, Dave Chappelle is another person whose name gets mentioned.
But can we argue, sorry to interrupt, can we argue that putting blackface in a comedic context is almost always minstrelsy?
I would say so. Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I didn't have as a criticism really at all for the way that the Dick Van Dyke Show did it. And I don't have a criticism as another show that did it in a non-comedic context was Mad Men. There was an episode where Roger, I can't remember, I think it's Sterling. Is it Roger Sterling? The character Roger dresses up in blackface at a garden party. And there's this look of kind of cringe on Don Draper's face, John Hamm's face, where it's like, it's very obvious that they are portraying something that literally would have happened. This is kind of an older guy in the early 60s who's, hanging on to some vestige of his own past that he obviously doesn't realize has really gone, again, out of fashion, is not really something that, sophisticated New Yorkers would really want to be associated with at all, even in 1962 or whatever.
Yeah.
But in the context of what was being portrayed, again, viewing media from this critical standpoint, in the context of what was being portrayed, that was, in my estimation, an acceptable, quote unquote, acceptable way to portray this, because it wasn't portrayed for laughs.
Right.
There was nothing that was supposed to be funny about it. It was very obvious in that context, like, this is not cool. This is really kind of embarrassing for him. And oh my goodness, it's crazy that this on some level was ever acceptable. But of course, this is a period drama.
Yeah.
And we're referencing something that would have authentically happened in the past versus just finding a reason to try to do it in the present.
Exactly.
But yeah, the question, the whole conversation about Black minstrelsy, I think that would be a really interesting video to do. I think, modern day Black minstrelsy.
Yeah. Where is the line?
Is an interesting conversation to have. Because it's like, hey, Black people deserve to laugh. We deserve to be able to laugh. Sometimes, that conversation.
Never earned the right to be funny.
Right. It's like that conversation can be a little bit maddening to me, I will say. And thank you for that. Thank you for taking us into this direction, Greg, because I feel like this is a video that needs to happen. I feel like, that is its own conversation. It's like, man, Black people we can't even relax and just kind of laugh and be funny in certain contexts because there is this history, because we have always had to view ourselves through the white gaze
of a jester.
And ask ourselves, what, as I said, back in the, early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, it was all we could do.
Exactly.
That was the only option that we had, was to be this kind of court jester type of character, to be accepted by white audiences, to have any sort of a career on the stage or as performers.
Yeah.
So there's a long tradition of that within the Black community.
Yeah.
And some of these folks, you've mentioned to me, you watch, I'm not trying to out you, but you used to watch like Amos and Andy back in the day.
Yeah. Like historical context, and seeing, my parents used it as a teaching tool. Number one, they own their own business, self-employed. Number two, though, this show itself, making it a modern, well, for that time, update of what vaudeville minstrelsy was uncomfortable. And it put us in a box, as you just said, that we had no recourse to escape. So this is a prison, even though there's this complicated economic mobility that's going on in the show, on this undertone of economic mobility. There's still this box of one-dimensional gesturism, to invent a word. And they were trying to show me how to think critically. I think that's what their objective was. It's like, yeah, that may be funny, but think about it. That's the only job that man could get as a Black actor in 1952 or whenever it was. And before him, it was a white man that invented the series and played that character.
Those characters on the radio.
So, and that's crazy about the gal he got a date with, too. I was just thinking, maybe through my disconnections, I might be able to dig you up a tuxedo somewhere myself.
So it's like, where could you run? You didn't have any options to this. And even though in this thing, they're showing these cats as economically mobile, there's a big problem here with keeping them in this box. So we definitely got schooled on them, and moving through the lexicon. It's just like, hey man, Red Fox is brilliant. Richard Pryor is brilliant. Bill Cosby at the time, brilliant. These are different levels of humor. These are different levels of engagement with the culture. Be able to disseminate what their methodology is.
Right. And it's just kind of, it's kind of always been my complaint. It's like, we've always had to have kind of a dual view of this as Black people, because on one hand, you want to acknowledge talent. You want to acknowledge when I used to crack up at Martin back in the day. Sure. I've cracked up at Tyler Perry and his silly antics. At the same time, there's all of this guilt.
Because there's a social responsibility.
In the Black community, there really is, especially with a certain type of Black person, I will say, that we feel like we have to be the arbiters of what is buffoonish.
Yeah.
The arbiters of what is acceptable. We have to comport ourselves with a certain amount of dignity and to have an understanding of what the past has been. Like, hey, we're not slipping into these little boxes that you all have created for us. Like, we're gonna continue to fight to not be perceived in this way.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like, can we be silly? There are white comedians doing this stuff. Even when you talk about cross-dressing in and of itself, which falls under a lot of criticism. Yeah. And I think it's kind of a sister issue to this minstrelsy and this kind of thing. I'm like, white comedians have been doing this as long as Black comedians have. Yeah. This is not exclusive to the Black community. This is not a direct attempt to emasculate the Black man. Y'all don't know anything about Milton Berle and all these comedians who were putting on dresses back in the day, just like Tyler Perry is. Why are we judged by a different standard?
It possibly because it disproportionately affects Black people in a way of, again, not the emasculation, but just all of the social weight that we have yet to assume because of this history. And I understand a comedian saying, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah,
absolutely
we have a different responsibility because there's a different history. The history is just different.
You said it.
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation and one that I hope to explore more deeply in a future breakdown. So stay tuned, and then maybe we'll come back and have a part 2 cool. of this part of the conversation. Cool. But I do want to pivot and talk about more of the contemporary shows, the comedies. And I just looked up Bamboozled. That movie was put out, interestingly enough, it was put out in 2000.
Oh, okay.
So that would have been a line of demarcation between that,
the 90s.
you know, that way that blackface had been portrayed. So we had a period where blackface was acceptable, I would say all the way through probably the early 40s. And really when the civil rights movement or talk of civil rights started to really come into the mainstream in the 1940s, this started to be a practice. It really just went out of fashion. It went out of style, and it just wasn't done anymore. After the days of vaudeville, it just wasn't as popular anymore. But you did see that carried through in films and classic films like Babes in Arms and all kinds of whatever, Holiday Inn and Swing Time with Fred Astaire, Holiday Inn with Bing Crosby, Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple, you know, was put in blackface. Judy Garland was put in blackface. We know about all of these classic examples of blackface, but then it went out of favor right around the middle of the 20th century. And then there was this period that I've talked about where it sort of made an interesting, very odd resurgence in probably the 70s and 80s, where we were referencing something that had happened in the past and like, oh, remember this? It's like every generation kind of has to have their time of grappling with it in their own way. And then in the 90s, it kind of fell off. You didn't really see too many examples of this. And I'm sure if there are examples that you all know of, you will let me know. But there were not too many examples that people could point to that happened in the 90s. And so then Bamboozled happened in 2000, which is just an interesting, I don't know. Is it a coincidence? Did this film maybe prompt a new resurgence of this kind of thing?
It's possible. It's possible. But I feel like sometimes when African Americans, we've always led the charge, either with style, with attitudes towards cultural literacy, as we were talking about earlier. People think, okay, the gate is open. Now I can do my commentary on it. But if it does not have the social responsibility, you know, I'm sorry to get on my soapbox for a second. I think it's moot. It's void. There has to be an education that happens. There has to be a Black person involved, and there has to be a consciousness that gets beyond the laugh if we're talking about comedy. How are we helping to not heavy-handedly teach people, but to let people know that they're okay? And encroaching on the line just for the laugh and moving on. Oh, they'll forget about it. It's another joke. No, that lingers. That lingers, and it does more damage, as you've already said, if there's no undercurrent of consciousness, of education that's behind it. That's my own personal take on it, but I've seen a lot of people sink and not swim because there's only the comedy. There's no undertow of information.
Yeah, and that's really I feel like that's really the brand, if I can use that word, the brand of blackface and brownface that started to happen after 2000 rolled around.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're starting to see this trickle in the mid 2000s to up through about, 7 or 8 years ago. You're starting to see a lot of these examples of this comedic blackface and brownface being used on shows like Community. And I want to come back to Community, but I want to throw out some other examples of it being used. We talked about Mad Men. There were talk shows like Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Sarah Silverman. 30 Rock was a huge offender when it came to blackface episodes. And they've gone back and have had to take off probably 6 different episodes that employed blackface. And I haven't really seen a lot of these episodes. I've seen clips and, images, visuals of them. But I got a bone to pick with Tina Fey because I feel like it's a deeper issue than just blackface. I feel like a lot of this cheap kind of easy humor that goes low on purpose.
Just because you have one Black person on the cast, let me add that. Go ahead.
Right, it's the low hanging fruit. It's and a lot of her thing was self-consciously like lowball humor. And again, Saturday Night Live, Greg can tell you, I am an ardent viewer of Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
Like I get the sophomoric humor, lowball humor. I get it. Don't have a problem with it. But when a person continues to just go to this well over and over and over again of this kind of racial humor, and it's not just blackface with 30 Rock.
Well, if it isn't Tweedledee and Tweedleblack.
We need to talk about. Get a haircut, or I'm going to shove you up a black guy's nose.
And I saw some of that same kind of thing in another Tina Fey, Robert Carlock show, because I think his name doesn't get called enough. Tina Fey, Robert Carlock show, which was the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. There were moments on that show that made me uncomfortable when it came to race.
Yeah. It's hard to really level the playing field with self depreciation or mockery, if you will, in a self-aware place when aiming that at another group who is still upwardly mobile. Mm-hmm. It's like you're still kicking someone down the ladder, even though it's unintentional. Mm-hmm. It's like if you're self-reflective or self-depreciating, maybe if you're in the majority group, white, you limit that to yourself and don't try to extend that over the aisle because it seems to be laden with trouble when that happens. And I feel like the few times that I've seen that show, that's the tone. Oh, we can poke fun at any and everybody and any and every kind because we do it to ourselves. Well, that may be fair for you, but it's not for someone else who is still upwardly mobile or represents a group that has not found their level.
And I think you can get away with it. Like we'll look at a show like Abbott Elementary, which has become one of our favorite shows to watch, where more than half the cast is Black. Mm-hmm. If there is, and we're even in a new age, even after 2010, this is a new playing field, really after 2016, I would say, a new playing field in terms of media representation of Black people in general. So to have a show like Abbott Elementary that is able to portray varied Black people, I mean, oftentimes if you are the only Black person on a show, then you have to be the most upstanding
on your
character. Right. You can't be a sleazeball. You can't be, the idiot on the show. You can't be the perv. You can't be a lot of things because you're the only Black guy or the only Black woman. Whereas a show like Abbott Elementary, I notice how often Quinta Brunson uses self-depreciating humor towards herself. Like she is the cuckold. Right. She is the that's a part of the charm of the show.
Exactly. And she's not the only Black person represented, as you said.
Right. You have a lot of different representations of Black people. And it's like, all right, so then we can take a little bit, I don't want to say a pot shot because it's not even that kind of a show. It's more of a sweet humor. Yeah. And not really like edgy or really risk-taking humor. Mm-hmm. But still, we see her at times, often, every show. Mm-hmm. She's the one that looks foolish. She's the one that looks silly.
And in contrast, Shirley Ralph's character is always elevated.
Right. Mm-hmm. But that's a contrast. Exactly. And we get to see it because there's more than one freaking Black person on the show. But when you have a show like 30 Rock, and there's one show that is even more egregious than 30 Rock, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But when you have a show like 30 Rock that literally has one Black character, there were some ancillary Black characters on the show. Also, I think maybe a writer or two, and then Sherry Shepherd played Tracy Jordan's wife, who I think Tracy Morgan is Tracy Jordan on the show, I believe. But, Tracy Morgan is essentially the only regular Black character on that show. So, like, when you start making Black jokes, it comes off in a particular way. And it's my humble opinion that Tracy Morgan tends to be a favorite of people who like a particular kind of Black humor. And that's not to take anything away from Tracy Morgan's talent, but there's a certain type of white person, I'm sorry to say, there's a certain type of white person that seems to be drawn to Tracy Morgan's humor because it does have a lot of that element, as we were talking about before, of a little bit of that kind of minstrel thing, a little bit of that buffoonery thing. Mm-hmm. Again, not to take anything away from his talent, but when you take him out of the context of just being around Black folks,
it's a different.
It just
energy.
comes off different.
It hits different.
It hits different. Mm-hmm. If Tracy Morgan is on a show with only other, because we watched a show he did with Tiffany Haddish, and I actually liked Tracy Morgan.
It was fantastic
on that show, and I'm like, what's different?
Yeah. He's got more room to play and more diversity to be with.
Yeah, and he was playing against other Black characters who were maybe a little bit more two-dimensional than he was. He could be more of a human being.
Oh yeah.
In that context. And it was a different show, of
The
course.
Last OG or something like that.
Yeah, The Last OG.
Brilliant.
That was a good show.
Yeah.
I think we kind of fell off with it after a point. Yeah. But it was a good show. Uh-huh. So I think it matters. Representation, as they say, representation matters. And a lot of it matters because, we as Black people do not get to be these multifaceted characters often. It's happening now more so than it ever has. Mm-hmm. But in addition to 30 Rock, and I wanted to talk about Community as well, but I think the worst offender, in my humble opinion, of any of these shows, these modern day shows that have employed blackface as a plot device and have done it irresponsibly, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. If I used heavy-handed language, I would say F that show. F It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And I've watched several episodes of it. And again, not to say that I don't get the humor, but it does bear a bit of a close similarity to certain white people's reality, because they just get to go out and be these irresponsible people who don't learn from anything. Then that's the joke of it. That's the joy of it. They're doing ridiculous, foolish things that people of any color would really not be able to get away with. It's just the whitest world. And that show infuriates me. It's something I probably wouldn't have picked up on when I was in my 20s. I probably would have been, trying to go along with it. Like, maybe it's just a show that I didn't find that funny, but now it aggravates my spirit.
Wow.
I really, really, really don't like that show. And the number of times they are as egregious as 30 Rock, but more so than 30 Rock. There are episodes where, they're just saying blatantly racist things. Just because, it's the character. It's not us. It's the character.
That's
She's really racist.
Way to hide.
Yeah, I'm gonna put up a clip or two on the YouTube version of this, and it's not pretty. It's not pretty. It's just it is what it is, and I'm sure those creators are not the least bit concerned with how it comes off, because all's fair, like you said. They're just everybody can catch it. Everybody can get it. And they do make fun of everybody. But when it comes to their treatment of black people, it's like, again, you don't have any regular 3-dimensional black people on your show, let alone more than one. You don't really have any representation on your show.
Still talking about a group that's upwardly mobile, coming from a majority perspective down to...
it's like at least provide representation on your show. Yeah. Even if black people aren't in a place of true representation in the culture at large, at least provide it on your show. And then maybe you can say, well, we earned the right to take digs at black people.
I heard you. I hear you.
Maybe you could say that if you really were providing some kind of real representation. But this is a group of 5 white people. It's what the whole show is about. And then you want to start taking digs at black people. It's below the belt. And no, this Always Sunny can catch these hands if I ever cross them on the street. And I'm closer than they think. Philadelphia. I do want to make mention of a couple of other shows before you land this plane.
Go ahead.
Community, because I keep saying I'm going to mention Community. Community is a very interesting example of this, and I think more so than Tropic Thunder, that this show, this episode of Community, where I believe the character's name is Chang, where he does blackface. This is one of the more interesting kind of morally gray, no pun intended, gray areas for me, because he dresses up like a character from Dungeons and Dragons. And the character, it's the blackest of black paint that he's wearing, or cork, or I don't know what they put on him, but he's like it's some kind of an elfin character. And I don't get into Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't know much about role player games or video games and those kinds of characters. So I really didn't have too much to say about this character, because a couple of people brought this up, and I was like, well, I've seen the image, the visual of what he did on that show. And it feels like this is in a different category. It feels like this is the world of fantasy. Let's not just, paint everything, again, no pun intended. Let's not paint everything with such a broad brush stroke, because, maybe this character is just, the character has black skin. He dressed up like this character. Let's just make this allowance for that. And then I went and watched commentary. I watched commentary by a woman named Khadija Mwobe, I think her last name is. And she's a huge fan of Community. And she's a YouTuber. And she did a commentary on it where she was saying, she didn't really have a problem with it. She's a black woman. But then she pointed me to a commentary of someone who is really involved in the world of role player games and understands Dungeons and Dragons and some of the, the lore behind these games. And he had a very interesting point of view and said, yes, these characters are actually coded as black, and I'm going to put the link to that in the description of the YouTube version of this.
Dark elves, or drow, were originally created with Dungeons & Dragons back in the 1970s. They were created as a separate type of elf with dark skin and white hair, just as Chang portrays them in the episode of Community.
I am Brutality Jobs, the magician. Magic user, baby. What?
In their descriptions within the game of D&D, this is an entire race of people with dark skin who are evil and meant to be feared. The original artwork of dark elves show them with short, curly hair, further separating them from the normal and good light-skinned elves who have long, straight hair.
And I would, not being someone who comes from that world, I wouldn't have had any idea that was the coding. Again, we're talking media literacy. You got to understand these references that are being made. The stuff comes from someplace.
That's right.
That didn't just come, they just spring up from the earth. These things are coded in a very specific way. And I believe that the creators of Dungeons and Dragons did come along and say, hey, we now understand. One of the creators came along and said, we understand, what the criticism of these characters.
Yeah.
And we apologize for doing this because we didn't really realize we were playing into, some really racist traditions. Yeah, another show that made a reference like that I never would have thought of was Star Trek with Romulans and Klingons.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that they were supposed to be darker skin.
Yeah.
When I look at that, it's one of my favorite shows, classic Star Trek, one of my absolute favorite shows. And they always just kind of looked a little bit greasy and oily to me.
There used to be jokes going around about Klingons as the soul
black people, yes.
in the universe.
Yeah, and Klingons and Romulans or whatever, but I didn't understand. But they're all, these aggressive, if you think about the descriptions of these characters, and you don't really think about it unless somebody points it out.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's like, oh my goodness. But this stuff impacts us in the real world. It's really not just about nitpicking and saying, hey, I can point this thing out and bring all of these, ancient references. It's like, no, that influences us in our daily lives and in our perception of human beings, our perception that darker skinned people are more aggressive and that they are evil and all of these, horrible stereotypes. But it's perpetuating those stereotypes without us even realizing that it is.
Yep.
Which is why, it's so important just to kind of go back to the basics. If you're black, if you're white, because if you're black, you're being just as impacted by this stuff as white people are. You can turn that stuff inward and become self-hating, just like a white person can turn that against you and unconsciously be treating you with bias because of this kind of thing. You can turn that on yourself, and I know I have been guilty of that in the past. And a lot of black folks are carrying this stuff around with us and we don't realize it.
That's right.
There's some healing and deliverance that needs to take place. No. I feel my grandmother rising up in me. There's also an episode of Different World, I want to say, too, that references, these stereotypes and these tropes. I'm not sure what the name of it is. But there's an episode of A Different World that talks about the mammy characters and all of that. So I wanted to give them an honorable mention, too. But yeah, a lot of it just, I say it keeps coming up in media, and there's a reason that it does. And I don't believe, I will say in my closing remarks, I don't believe that these episodes should be removed. And I've done a whole breakdown on why I don't feel like they should be removed. And we're removing them from our general consciousness and pretending that they didn't exist. The only person that benefits, the only people that benefit from those Blackface episodes of 30 Rock being taken down, and it was Tina Fey's decision, are Tina Fey and Robert Carlock. They're the ones who benefit and the people who put on the blackface. It's like all of a sudden it just gets expunged from their record.
People forget, excuse me. Yeah.
We want to forget that it ever happened.
The culture forgets that it was there. Exactly. It was never there.
Yeah.
It's like, vanished. We didn't do that.
Right. It's not as bad as you
we learned our lesson and all this.
It's not as bad as you're saying, you guys just make too big a deal of it. This is something in the past. No. This happened 10 years ago. Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah. Again, before we move into my favorite segment, the Finding Your Voice segment, give them all your handles again. We want to remind folks and thank the new Patreon subscribers for coming on over to Patreon. If you're hearing this on your podcast provider or if you're seeing this on YouTube, Dara does have a Patreon. One more time, Dara.
Patreon.com/Dara Star Tucker.
Thank you. Instagram is
Dara Tucker B.
TikTok.
TikTok is Dara Star Tucker. Facebook is Dara Star Tucker.
Twitter.
YouTube is Dara Star Tucker. Twitter, for what that's worth, is Dara Star Tucker as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you to everyone for downloading, sharing this podcast. And if you are listening to it and you want to pass it along, we are on YouTube. Love for you to join the YouTube page as well. Thank you.
Come let me love you. Let me give my life to you. Let me drown in your laughter. Let me die in your arms. Let me lay down beside you. Let me always be near you. Ooh, come let me love you. Come love me again.
So in today's episode of Finding Your Voice, I want to talk about getting comfortable with all of the facets of who you are. My podcast is called I'm All Over the Place for a reason, because I truly am all over the place. I'm doing any number of things at any given time. You all know that I do videos online. Even the type of videos that I do are so varied. You're going to see me do teaching videos. You're going to see me do opinion pieces. You've probably seen some of my comedy videos that I do. And I also present my music from time to time. And my life is just as varied. I find myself with my hand in this bucket and that pot. And there are times when I feel like I don't even really know what the focus of my life necessarily is or what I want it to be. But I feel like I'm moving into a phase of life where I am beginning to embrace all of these disparate parts of myself. You feel like you've accepted that about yourself. And then on some deeper level, when you find yourself questioning even more and more, who am I? What is my life about? Then you realize, like, wait a minute, I'm still not in a place of true acceptance with this. So I'm moving into a place now where I'm going to have to begin to focus more on my music. We just recorded an album, as I said earlier, and we will be releasing that album in June, which I'm really looking forward to. I'm really excited about. But I'm going to have to shift gears here. I'm going to have to do a serious pivot, which is not the most comfortable thing for me to do. I'm totally in content creation mode. I love doing videos for you guys. It's one of my favorite things to do. But I have something called a wood shop network that's coming up here really soon, where I'm going to be totally focused for a couple of weeks with a workshop that is going to be completely geared towards me focusing back in on my music and helping me to gear up for what we have coming later this year. We're going to start releasing singles in April. It's going to look different. My life is going to look different this year than it has in the past. And I'm getting my head around that and trying to get to the point where I'm okay with it, because I've settled into the mode of just being freelance with creating videos and doing some other things that I have going on. But there's a shift, there's a sea change that's coming for me in that area and in a lot of other areas. And so just encouraging you all to let's go with the flow. Oprah says you have to make your life, and she's not the originator of this quote, but she likes to quote the line that you have to allow yourself to be like water and just float freely through your life. And when the changes come and when you have to make those adjustments, we have to be able to move nimbly around those adjustments. And I'm experiencing that on a level that I never have before. I enjoy a lot of what's going on in my life right now, but it's a little bit harder for me these days to accept that I can't just hang out in any one gear for too long. I have to be nimble. I have to allow myself to make adjustments on a dime and not get too settled in with any sort of mode of operation, because that isn't my life. That's just not how it's going to be. And I know a lot of you probably have lives that are quite similar for maybe different reasons. But when you have that feeling of needing to make those adjustments, it's not something that we should be fighting. It's something that we should be embracing. And I think the sooner that we can make those adjustments and accept that there is a shift that's coming in life, then the happier that we will be, the quicker we will embrace the next thing that's ahead. It's hard for me to imagine that the things that lay ahead for me this year will be just as interesting and fun and as exciting as the things that I'm doing now. But I have to believe that better is on the way, that more positive things are on the way. And it's not something that's pulling me away from my purpose, but it's something that's drawing me closer to that sense of purpose. So I want to encourage those of you who have multifaceted and varied lives to be as flexible as you can possibly be and just accept all of the varied elements of what your life truly is, because there's joy that lays ahead. Let's not move with fear, but let's move with courage and expectation, because better is on the way. And I know I sound like a preacher. I say that every other episode, but I really do feel like my grandmother sometimes. Anyway, I'm Dara Star Tucker. Thank you all for joining me. I'm really looking forward to catching you on the next episode. Follow me on social media, and I look forward to seeing you next time.